So, uh, have you ever noticed how, like, certain problems in a massive organization get fixed almost immediately if the right alarm bells go off? But then other, much bigger problems just quietly accumulate for literally years.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the most frustrating organizational paradoxes we encounter, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you could be looking at a multi-billion-dollar corporation or like a massive city government, and if a specific compliance form is missing, I don't know, a single signature.
Right, the whole thing stops.
Exactly. The entire machinery halts until it's rectified. But if employee burnout is skyrocketing or, public infrastructure is slowly rusting away into the river, there is just silence.
Yeah, no alarms at all. Just a slow, widely accepted decay. We naturally assume that institutions prioritize their time and resources
Huh.
based on, well, the actual severity of a problem.
Right, because that would be logical.
Exactly. But the reality of institutional machinery is far less rational and much more mechanical.
Yeah.
Institutions don't actually respond to severity, they respond to structure.
And that distinction is like the core mission for today's deep dive. We're exploring this really fascinating essay by Elias Kunis called The Asymmetric Carrier Problem.
It's such a great piece.
It really is. Our goal today is to uncover these hidden procedural structures. I kind of think of them as invisible VIP passes, the things that decide exactly which harms an institution actually processes and which ones are just structurally doomed to be ignored.
Right. And if you are trying to wrap your head around this dynamic, imagine the backdrop of our conversation today as a massive, impossibly complex Rube Goldberg machine.
Oh, I love that visual.
Yeah. So that machine represents everyday institutional bureaucracy. It has, thousands of gears, pulleys, intake chutes, conveyor belts. But as you look closer at the machine, you notice that only a very specific few pathways are brightly illuminated.
And everything else operates in the shadows.
Exactly. The illuminated paths are the ones equipped with what Kunis calls carriers.
Having a name for this invisible bureaucratic force is just incredibly clarifying. I mean, it's a dynamic you feel constantly in modern administrative life,
Oh, for sure. Every day.
whether you are dealing with your HR department or the DMV. But until you can actually see the architecture of it, you can't understand why the machine acts the way it does.
And that is the real value of Kunis's framework. Today is really about giving you a portable diagnostic.
Right.
We aren't just going to sit here and admire the problem of institutional drift or complain about government inefficiency. We
Yeah.
want to break down the actual physical mechanics of administrative attention so you can diagnose it in the systems around you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the anatomy of the machine. Before we can understand why the system produces all these ignored accumulating problems, we kind of have to understand how a claim successfully gets through the door in the first place.
Right, the intake process.
Yeah. Think about bringing a complaint to a massive institution. It's like walking into a highly rigid hospital triage system where the software algorithm only recognizes certain predetermined symptoms.
That's a really good way to put it.
Like you could be standing there literally having a heart attack, but because there is literally no checkbox for chest pain on their intake clipboard, the system just cannot see your emergency.
Yeah, that triage analogy is spot on. The thing that forces the system to see you that checkbox is what Kunis calls a carrier. The thing carrying your claim into the active machinery of the institution is almost never the moral weight of the harm itself.
Right. It's not about what's right or wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is a specific procedural attribution structure, and Kunis breaks down the anatomy of a strong carrier into 5 distinct components. If you want your problem to be treated as an admissible, response-triggering object by a bureaucracy, you really need these 5 elements working together.
Okay, let's pull those 5 components apart. What actually makes up this procedural VIP pass?
So first, you need a bearer. This means someone who can actually stand up with legal or procedural standing and say, this happened to me.
Like an actual person or a specific group?
Right. It has to be a named claimant or a highly stable, enumerable category of people. You cannot just be a vague cloud of generalized public grievance.
Which honestly explains why class action lawsuits are such a powerful tool in the legal system.
Oh, perfectly.
Because a diffuse public harm, like a million people being overcharged by a single dollar, doesn't have a bearer. The class action essentially artificially bundles that vague grievance into a defined, singular legal bearer that the system can actually recognize.
That is exactly what a class action does. It manufactures a bearer. But, a bearer alone isn't enough. The second component is a category.
Okay, the category.
The institution must already recognize the specific type of harm you're experiencing as a thing it's authorized to process.
Yeah.
It has to fit into a pre-existing statutory or administrative box.
So if it's a completely new problem, you're out of luck.
Pretty much. If your problem is entirely novel, or say it falls between the jurisdictions of two different departments, the machine literally cannot register it.
Wow. Okay, so you have a bearer and a category. What is the third component?
Third is a forum. You need a defined place to bring the problem where it can actually be heard.
Like a literal desk.
Yeah, exactly. This could be a court of law, an official ombudsman, a regulatory intake portal, or an administrative appeals board. There must be a physical or digital desk where the claim is deposited.
But, I mean, dropping a piece of paper on a desk doesn't guarantee anyone will read it. Which brings us to the fourth component, and arguably, I think, the most important one, the trigger.
Oh, absolutely the most important. The trigger is the engine of the carrier. When your claim arrives at the forum, something must legally or procedurally fire.
Right, like a ticking clock.
Yes, usually a statutory deadline. Say, a rule stating the agency must respond within 30 days. It could be a mandatory response requirement, an automatic escalation to a manager, or even a financial sanction if the agency fails to act.
Because without a trigger, your perfectly categorized claim, sitting in the correct forum, just becomes another piece of paper sitting in an inbox until the end of time.
Precisely. And finally, you need the fifth component, which is the incentive. Someone needs to gain status, money, votes, professional credit, or legal leverage by carrying your claim forward.
So you need an ecosystem around it.
Right. You need actors, lawyers, journalists, advocacy groups, or ambitious middle managers who are rewarded by the broader system for turning the crank on your specific issue.
Okay, let's look at a concrete example to see a full carrier stack in action, so to speak. Look at a standard FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act filing.
That is the perfect illustration of this machinery.
Yeah, so if you file a FOIA request, you have a named requester, right? So you have a bearer.
Yeah.
The law explicitly recognizes public records requests, so you have a category.
Yep, check and check.
The holding agency has a specific FOIA office, giving you a defined forum. The law mandates a response within a set number of days, so that's a hard trigger, and journalists or lawyers are rewarded with news scoops or legal fees for pursuing denials, providing the incentive structure.
And when you combine those 5 elements, your claim arrives at the agency with accelerants already attached. The agency doesn't process the FOIA request because the mid-level bureaucrats suddenly feel this, deep philosophical commitment to democratic transparency.
Right, they aren't just being nice.
No, they process it because the procedural machinery leaves them no choice. The carrier forces the claim onto the procedural register.
Okay, so the carrier guarantees your request gets processed.
Yeah.
But, I mean, institutional resources are finite. If the bureaucratic bouncer is letting all the VIPs in immediately because they hold this 5-part pass, someone else is getting pushed to the back of the line. Where does that displaced pressure actually go?
And this is the core of Kunis's thesis. We are entering the territory of carrier asymmetry. Let's stick with that public records request example. The FOIA request arrives, the 20-day statutory clock starts ticking, and the agency legally has to respond. But as you noted, the agency has finite staff and a finite budget. To meet that strict, legally mandated deadline, an agency manager has to displace workload.
They have to steal Peter to pay Paul.
Exactly. They have to pull staff time away from other duties. Maybe the backlog of complex, uncategorized citizen requests grows. Maybe routine data maintenance slips. Maybe basic infrastructure inspections get delayed.
And the crucial point here is that those displaced problems do not have carriers. The routine data maintenance doesn't have a statutory countdown clock.
Right.
The infrastructure inspection doesn't have an incentivized lawyer ready to sue if it gets delayed by a week.
So the displaced workload is structurally silent. Carrier asymmetry arises when one side of an institutional trade-off has a highly structured, legally reinforced procedural VIP pass, and the side bearing the displaced cost does not.
Wow.
The machine automatically routes resources toward the carrier, and the cost simply falls into the shadows. Kunis calls this the silent cost.
I want to pause here and challenge this framing just a bit, because reading through the text, this sounded very familiar. Wait, isn't this just Mancur Olson's old public choice theory?
I see where you're going.
Yeah, the idea that highly organized interest groups with concentrated benefits will always beat out unorganized citizens who bear dispersed costs. It kind of feels like we are just putting a new, complicated label on organized lobbying and rent-seeking.
It's a very perceptive pushback, But what's fascinating here is that the distinction Kunis makes is vital. This is emphatically not just public choice theory.
Okay, how so?
Well, public choice usually assumes that actors are maliciously or greedily extracting resources through organized lobbying. Kunis points out that carrier asymmetry is structural plumbing, not just organized influence. Organization is just one potential source of carrier components. It is not the carrier itself.
Walk me through the difference there.
Think about it this way. A statutory path with a hard deadline. A strong carrier works even if there is absolutely no organized constituency backing it up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If a law dictates that an agency must respond to a specific type of citizen filing within 30 days, the agency will shift resources to meet that deadline, even if the person filing it is completely unorganized, unfunded, and acting entirely alone. The plumbing handles the work.
Oh, I see.
Conversely, you can have an incredibly well-organized, highly funded group of citizens, but if their specific grievance doesn't map to any institutional category and has no legal forum or trigger, they will get nowhere. They will just be an organized group shouting at a brick wall.
That is a fascinating distinction. So organized lobbying is just one way to try and build a carrier, but the asymmetry we are talking about is much deeper. It's about the hard-coded procedural logic of the institution itself.
Exactly. It's a tragedy of structure rather than, a conspiracy of bad actors. A well-meaning bureaucrat is literally forced to ignore the silent cost because the system filters it out of their daily dashboard.
And the real-world impacts of this structural filtering are severe and pervasive because the silent costs compound over time. The essay uses some incredibly stark examples to illustrate these carrierless victims.
Yeah, the bridge example really stood out.
Yes. Consider a city planner looking at a decaying bridge. Routine maintenance is desperately needed, but that maintenance gets deferred year after year to fund a more highly visible, politically incentivized project.
Like a new transit hub.
Right, something that comes with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and satisfies specific federal grant categories. The motorist driving over the rusting bridge has no bearer, no defined forum to demand a paint job, and no statutory trigger. They are completely invisible to the machine until the bridge literally fails.
Or look at the healthcare system. Imagine a hospital patient whose routine yet necessary surgery is suddenly bumped from the schedule.
Why?
Because the surgical ward's capacity had to be reallocated to a litigation-protected case.
And the bumped patient has no idea.
Exactly. They likely don't even know the reallocation happened behind the scenes. They just receive a phone call saying they have to wait another 6 months in pain. The litigation-protected case had a powerful carrier, a credible legal threat, a defined procedural category, an incentive for lawyers.
And the routine surgery patient had none of those things.
None. They simply absorbed the structural displacement. They became the silent cost.
This framework makes intuitive sense. It's like you press down on one side of a balloon, it bulges on the other. If you mandate an action, you displace a resource. But is there measurable proof that institutions actually shift their burdens toward the silent side in this predictable way? Because we kind of need more than just theoretical logic here.
And we have it. Administrative triage is a measured causal fact. Kunis anchors this theoretical framework in a robust 2025 empirical study by researchers Kaplaner, Nil, and Steinbach.
Right, the EPA study. Here's where it gets really interesting. What exactly did the researchers find when they looked at the EPA?
So the researchers analyzed what happened when the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency absorbed massive, new, strict statutory obligations under the acid rain program in the 1990s. Picture an industrial landscape. Thousands of factories, smokestacks, sprawling complexes across the country.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The EPA was suddenly tasked with enforcing complex new emissions caps on a specific subset of these facilities.
And crucially, Congress didn't magically double the EPA's budget or staff to handle this massive new program, right? They had to metabolize this new mandate within their existing constraints.
Precisely. Now, the acid rain program obligations came heavily equipped with procedural carriers. There were strict statutory deadlines, incredibly clear categories of compliance, defined regulatory forums, and heavy sanctions for failure.
So a ton of VIP passes were suddenly handed out.
Yes. So a mid-level EPA manager staring at their resource dashboard had to prioritize these covered sites. If they missed the deadlines, the agency faced immediate structured blowback. And the researchers found measurable, direct causal evidence of what happened next.
Which was
enforcement on the non-covered industrial sites. The facilities not protected by these strict new carriers dropped significantly.
because the manager literally had to pull inspectors off their routine routes to deal with the acid rain paperwork. It's like a waterbed. The finite workload and resources of the agency don't just disappear because you added a new mandate.
Right.
The water just bulges out into the areas with the least resistance. The carrierless side absorbs the shock.
It goes even deeper than simply ignoring the non-covered sites. The researchers found that even the surviving enforcement on those non-covered sites shifted in a very specific way.
How so?
The EPA shifted away from rigorous, resource-intensive on-site physical inspections and moved toward much lighter administrative off-site document reviews.
Wait, so they just stopped going out to the actual sites?
Yeah, they moved to administrative document review. The institution routed its finite energy to answer the carrier-equipped demands, and the silent cost landed squarely on the actual environmental safety of the non-covered sites.
Wow. So the procedural box was checked, but the reality on the ground decayed.
Exactly.
But this creates a really uncomfortable paradox, though, because the things creating all this displaced friction, strict rules, judicial reviews, mandatory public appeals are fundamental democratic rights. We use these tools to protect the environment and protect individual citizens.
Right.
I mean, we can't just strip away the right to due process or a fair hearing just to make the DMV or the EPA run faster.
And that is the tightrope Kunis is walking. He introduces a crucial distinction to address that exact paradox. He divides bureaucratic friction into two separate types. First, there is protective friction.
Okay, protective friction.
This includes things like the courts, due process hearings, minority rights protections, and environmental impact reviews.
Yeah.
Protective friction has a recognized vital public function. It is a deliberate feature of constitutional design meant to protect vulnerable people from arbitrary state power. Has named carriers, and we absolutely need it.
Right. Nobody's arguing we should bulldoze a neighborhood for a highway without allowing the residents a forum to appeal.
But here is the mechanism we continually ignore. That necessary protective friction inherently generates a massive amount of secondary friction. Kunis calls this secondary layer unknown implementation friction.
Unowned implementation friction. So this is like the residue of the process.
Exactly. Let's say you have a long, rigorous, multi-year judicial review process for a new environmental permit or a clean energy project. That process itself is protective friction. It ensures all voices are heard.
Good thing.
Right. But the result of that rigorous process might be 5 years of absolute delay. That 5 years of delay doesn't just evaporate, it lands somewhere.
Yeah, it has a cost.
It lands on the unbuilt green infrastructure. It lands on the workers who don't have jobs, or the community that doesn't get the new transit line. That delay, the exponential queue growth, the operator burnout, that is the residue.
And the residue has no carrier. Nobody structurally owns the repair of the 5-year delay. There is no statutory trigger forcing the government to compensate for the lost time.
That is the tragedy of it. The goal of this framework isn't to dismantle protective friction or remove due process. It's to force us to acknowledge that the residue is real, it's compounding, and we have fundamentally failed to build carriers to manage that residue.
Connecting these concepts really brings the whole picture into focus.
Yeah.
Because we see this unowned friction everywhere, across every sector of society, and we've developed a dozen different academic and political names for why things feel so stuck.
So many names.
Right. We call it kludgiocracy, where government is just a layered, unnavigable mess of temporary fixes. We call it demosclerosis, the inability of institutions to adapt to new challenges. We talk endlessly about administrative burden or policy accumulation.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, all of those literatures, kludgiocracy, administrative burden, public choice, they're all essentially naming overlapping manifestations of the exact same deeper structural imbalance. They are describing the downstream symptoms.
And carrier asymmetry is the cause.
Yes. Carrier asymmetry is the upstream generator. It is the hidden physics engine producing all of these different named pathologies.
And this upstream generator produces what the essay calls the telos gap. Let's ground this concept because it's incredibly powerful. Telos essentially means the ultimate purpose or aim of a thing, right?
Correct.
So the telos gap is the massive space between what an institution is morally supposed to do and what it actually has the procedural plumbing to accomplish.
It is a downstream condition where everyone possesses the knowledge that a harm exists, but no one possesses the ownership to fix it.
Right.
We all see the bridge rusting. The city council possesses reports detailing the rust. The mayor knows about the rust. But because there is no carrier, no legal deadline forcing a repair this fiscal year, no incentivized ombudsman empowered to sue over deferred maintenance before the collapse, the rust sits squarely in the telos gap.
The purpose exists, but the plumbing does not. The machine knows the problem is there, but the machinery is not triggered to act. Which brings us to the ultimate utility of this deep dive. Because this isn't just an abstract theory about bureaucracy, it is a portable diagnostic tool you can use every single day. Whenever you are looking at a declared duty, a highly publicized organizational harm, or a failing system, you really must ask one specific diagnostic question.
And that question is, which side has a response triggering carrier in this forum, and which side is left as residue?
Let me repeat that, because it is the lens through which you can start decoding the matrix of institutional behavior. Which side has a response triggering carrier in this form, and which side is left as residue?
It changes everything once you see it.
It really does. If the visible active side of a trade-off has a carrier, a bearer, a category, a forum, a trigger, and an incentive, and the side paying the cost of that trade-off does not, then you are watching carrier asymmetry in action.
And adopting this lens radically changes how you approach organizational reform. Because if you just look at a failing city department and call it a kludgeocracy or, attribute it to lazy bureaucrats, the standard advice is usually just to demand they try harder.
Run an efficiency audit. Coordinate better. Write another white paper.
Right, which almost never works. Because demanding people try harder doesn't change the hard-coded physics of the machine they are operating.
But if you correctly diagnose the problem as carrier asymmetry, the prescription becomes structurally specific. The architectural answer to institutional drift isn't try harder. It is structurally installing symmetric carriers on the silent side.
Exactly. If you want the displaced cost to be addressed, you have to build it a forum, assign it a strict deadline, and give it an owner in the exact same way the protective claims are equipped. You have to balance the scales of the procedural machinery.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this? How would you actually apply this diagnostic in your daily life? Whether you are trying to navigate a rigid corporate bureaucracy that refuses to fix a broken internal tool, or you are looking at a city council that can't seem to fill a dangerous pothole while simultaneously managing to approve massive, complex new compliance rules, you now have the framework to understand why.
Look for the missing components.
Exactly. Ask yourself. On the side, bearing the cost, the employees dealing with the broken tool, the drivers hitting the pothole, is there a named bearer? Is there a recognized administrative category? Is there a designated forum to hear the complaint? Is there a mandatory trigger forcing a response? Is there an incentive for someone inside the machine to champion it?
And if those elements are missing, you aren't dealing with a lack of willpower or human empathy. You are dealing with a missing procedural VIP pass.
You are looking at the invisible architecture of institutional drift. The machinery is simply routing its finite energy around the silent costs, performing exactly as its plumbing dictates.
That's the reality of it.
This framework completely shifts how I view organizational paralysis. It replaces frustration with structural clarity. But it does leave me with one final, deeply challenging thought. Kunas touches on something called the recursion problem in his work.
Ah, yes, the recursion problem.
Yeah. If we accept that the solution is to build these carriers for the silent costs, we have to acknowledge that building a carrier is really hard. Securing a legal forum, passing a law to create a statutory trigger, organizing a stable category of bearers, these actions require immense institutional energy, organization, and political capital.
Building the procedural plumbing is an incredibly resource-intensive endeavor. It requires the very capital that marginalized groups often lack.
Right. So here is the puzzle for you to ponder as you look at the asymmetric systems operating around you. If the people who are bearing the ultimate silent costs, the displaced workers, the marginalized patients bumped from the schedule, the future generations inheriting deferred infrastructure maintenance are, by definition, the most depleted, exhausted, and unresourced people in the system. How do they ever gather the capital required to build the very first carrier? How do the people trapped in the shadows of that massive Rube Goldberg machine finally build a bright enough light to force the system to see them? It's a heavy question, but armed with this diagnostic, you can finally see the machine for what it truly is. It's not about who yells the loudest on the sidewalk, it's about who holds the VIP pass.